Washington burned, yet the United States did not surrender. The apparent knockout was a raid whose military consequences remained dangerously incomplete. At Capitol Hill, flames climbed through furniture and curtains while the British ensign flew above the young federal capital. President James Madison had fled. American troops were scattered, and government offices stood abandoned before exhausted British soldiers arrived. Everything visible suggested defeat, but visibility was the trap. Washington embodied national authority without containing America's main armies or resources. To understand why the fire failed to decide the war, we must follow what Britain could destroy and what survived. Before flames reached Washington, distant cannon at Bladensburg had announced the collapse of the capital's hastily assembled defense that afternoon. On August 24, British troops rose around 3 in the morning, then marched 10 miles through oppressive summer heat. They then fought for roughly 3 hours, forcing American defenders from the river approaches and opening the road westward. These were not fresh conquerors marching into a finished campaign. They were tired, thirsty, and still 5 miles away. Major General Robert Ross paused for 2 hours, preserving cohesion before committing his brigades to the final approach at dusk. That pause revealed a constraint often hidden by the famous flames. British success depended upon endurance, timing, and naval mobility. Washington offered few fortifications and no reliable defending army once the line at Bladensburg dissolved into retreat and confusion. American soldiers appeared from the east, exhausted and disordered, transforming distant battlefield noise into proof that the road lay open. Residents packed what they could while officials departed the federal city, and many civilians crossed the Long Bridge toward Virginia. The bridge stretched across the Potomac, offering escape from a capital whose defenders, government, and command structure were disappearing together. Dolly Madison left the president's house as evacuation overtook ceremony, and the building became an undefended political symbol behind her. No single evacuation ended American resistance. It merely removed national leaders from a place they could no longer protect. That distinction would matter later. For now, the city looked leaderless, and the approaching British force seemed entirely unopposed. Ross reached the old circus grounds near Bladensburg Road, leaving 2 brigades behind while taking another toward Capitol Hill. Rear Admiral George Cockburn rode with him, bringing the aggressive Chesapeake raiding experience that had shaped the campaign thus far. They approached beneath a flag of truce and may initially have sought ransom rather than immediate destruction of Washington. Negotiation never developed. As the party climbed Capitol Hill, gunfire erupted from nearby buildings, leaving casualties among the British ranks. Ross's horse was shot beneath him, and the sudden attack ended whatever possibility remained for a negotiated entry into Washington. British troops surrounded and searched a nearby house but found no attacker. The building was then set ablaze beside them. Michael Shiner, a black dock worker enslaved at the Navy Yard, later recorded the Redcoats' rockets and flying rafters. His account captures the transition. From an exhausted column seeking entry, the British became occupiers answering resistance with fire. The Capitol was difficult to ignite because sheet metal protected its ceilings. Rockets fired through windows achieved little at first. Soldiers therefore carried combustible materials inside, piling tables, desks, chairs, and curtains within the chambers of Congress itself. Rocket fuel helped turn that furniture into kindling, and the resulting heat reportedly melted glass lighting globes overhead there. Embers rose above Capitol Hill and carried fire toward a nearby boarding house, while smoke spread across the unfinished city. The destruction was deliberate but targeted chiefly at government and military property. It was punishment, occupation, and spectacle combined. With the Capitol burning behind them, Ross and Cockburn moved along Pennsylvania Avenue with roughly 150 men. The scale is revealing. A small detachment could reach the executive residence because organized resistance inside Washington had vanished. Around 11 that night, British troops entered the hurriedly abandoned president's house, where furnishings, food, and drink remained inside. Officers consumed what was available, but the celebrated victory dinner grew in later retellings beyond what evidence can securely establish. Soon, the residence burned. By morning, its roof was gone, leaving a shell where national authority had conducted business. From Capitol Hill, the Union Jack flew over Washington, presenting Britain with a powerful image of imperial retaliation achieved. Images, however, do not move supplies, destroy distant armies, or compel negotiators unless material pressure accompanies them beyond the city. The British held the center of American government, but Madison remained free, and the country's military geography remained largely intact. At dawn, the occupation would continue with more public buildings marked for destruction, even as the campaign outran Washington's streets. Morning revealed a capital still occupied, with the Treasury already burning and British detachments turning toward the remaining executive offices. Around 8, soldiers attacked the buildings housing the State and War Departments, extending destruction beyond the previous night's most famous targets. Crucial records had already escaped in wagons, alongside captured British colors preserved from the Revolutionary War and removed before occupation. Their survival demonstrated an important limit. Buildings could burn while the administrative memory and legitimacy they represented traveled elsewhere. British vengeance concentrated on public institutions and military facilities, although neighboring properties sometimes caught fire amid smoke, confusion, and shifting orders. Ross and Cockburn sometimes accepted residents' pleas to spare homes and businesses, complicating any simple picture of uncontrolled destruction. 3 private rope walks were burned because their cordage could supply naval operations, placing them within Britain's practical definition of military infrastructure. Some of Washington's widest fires came from American decisions intended to deny useful facilities and crossings to the invaders. Americans burned 2 Eastern Branch bridges and ignited the Navy Yard, sacrificing valuable property rather than leaving it available for capture. Together, British and American fires created a glow reportedly visible from Baltimore and Leesburg, roughly 35 miles beyond Washington. Confusion also opened government buildings to local looters, who carried away silver and other property before order could return. Paul Jennings, enslaved in Madison's household, later recalled opportunistic theft inside the president's house during the government's hurried flight. British soldiers also stole, despite officers attempting to enforce discipline through severe punishments against men caught taking private goods. The occupation therefore resisted a neat image. Controlled targeting and restraint existed beside retaliation, indiscipline, accidental spread, and opportunism. Washington could not sustain the invaders indefinitely, because occupation demanded supplies, security, communications, and protection from gathering American forces. Ross had brought a raiding column, not an army equipped to govern a hostile capital or penetrate the continental interior. Every additional day increased dependence on the route back toward British ships, the expedition's transport, supply base, and secure withdrawal. Occupying the city created no mechanism for collecting national surrender, disarming distant forces, or preventing Congress from meeting somewhere else. Madison's government had suffered humiliation and disruption, but its leaders remained beyond British custody and retained constitutional authority to continue the war. Unlike a fortified arsenal or concentrated field army, Washington contained symbols whose loss carried immense political weight but limited operational leverage. Britain had reason to value that political shock, especially after American forces had burned public buildings at York and Upper Canada. Retaliation helped explain the chosen targets, while Chesapeake raids also pressured communities, diverted defenders, and exposed federal weakness ashore. Measured as a punitive raid, Washington was a success. Measured as a means of ending the war, it remained unfinished. To convert spectacle into decision, Britain needed Americans to conclude that further resistance would bring greater costs without realistic improvement. That conclusion depended upon what happened next at ports, lakes, borders, and negotiation tables, untouched by Washington's burning masonry. Napoleon's first defeat had released British troops from Europe, allowing London to reinforce North America and pursue stronger pressure. The United States faced strained finances, uneven militia performance, exposed coastlines, and political opposition that complicated every defensive decision. Washington's fall confirmed those weaknesses, particularly poor preparation, fragmented command, and the danger of concentrating responsibility without dependable troops. The war was not there. American privateers still operated. Armies remained in the field, forts guarded approaches, and negotiators had not accepted Britain's preferred terms. The Republic's scale made coercion difficult. British naval power could strike coastlines, yet controlling inland territory required different resources. Even Washington was reachable because Chesapeake waterways carried British power deep inland before troops marched over the final roads. Baltimore presented another problem: a commercially important port with prepared defenses, concentrated resistance, and waterways guarded by Fort McHenry. The city supported privateering and commerce, giving Britain a practical military objective beyond punishment or the destruction of national symbols. News from Washington intensified the danger, but it also gave Baltimore's defenders unmistakable evidence that warnings could no longer be discounted. After leaving the capital, Ross's force returned toward its ships with trophies and destruction behind it, not American capitulation. The next operation would test whether Chesapeake mobility could break a defended city rather than exploit an exposed government center. Washington had shown what disorganization cost. Baltimore now had time to assemble militia, strengthen earthworks, and coordinate harbor defenses. For British commanders, the capital's easy capture reasonably suggested that another sharp blow might deepen panic and improve bargaining power. The assumption was not foolish, but its evidence came from a city abandoned after one broken defense line outside its streets. Washington's destruction had exposed American weakness, but British strategy still required separate campaigns to reinforce the same political pressure. Along Chesapeake Bay, British ships offered movement, supply, and escape routes unavailable to armies operating far inland from navigable water. Naval control let raiders choose vulnerable points, forcing Americans to watch many possible landings with limited trained troops and uncertain warning. The same advantage imposed a boundary. Every advance away from ships stretched food, ammunition, transport, communications, and confidence in withdrawal. Washington sat within reach of the Chesapeake and lacked strong defenses, making it unusually exposed despite its immense symbolic value. Capturing it did not deliver Baltimore's harbor, northern supply routes, western settlements, or American naval forces fighting on inland waters. Nor could the raid erase the reasons American leaders had entered war, however disputed those aims remained by 1814. Maritime restrictions and impressment had helped provoke conflict, while frontier ambitions and domestic politics shaped American choices and divisions. After years of uneven fighting, neither government possessed an easy path to force the other into complete submission. Britain could blockade ports, raid coasts, and defend Canada, but conquering the Republic would demand manpower on a continental scale. The United States could survive battlefield defeats, yet its credit, commerce, and public patience weakened whenever British pressure expanded. Peace negotiations therefore unfolded beside military operations, with each campaign altering what diplomats might demand or refuse at Ghent. London did not need permanent conquest everywhere if military setbacks persuaded Washington to accept harsher boundaries or strategic restraints. American negotiators needed proof that continued resistance could deny Britain enough leverage to make compromise preferable to escalation. Burning the capital strengthened Britain's hand only if subsequent operations confirmed that American defenses would collapse wherever seriously tested. Failure elsewhere would reverse that interpretation, recasting Washington as an isolated penetration against the Republic's least defensible political center. The next tests developed along two distant corridors, Baltimore and the Chesapeake and Plattsburgh beside Lake Champlain in northern New York. Geography connected both contests to water power, but each required cooperation between ships and soldiers under tight operational limits. At Baltimore, British troops needed to approach from land while naval forces passed Fort McHenry and harbor obstructions offshore. At Plattsburgh, a larger army advancing south depended upon command of Lake Champlain for supplies and secure movement. Success in either theater required more than bravery or numbers. It required the separate parts of each operation to align. Washington had demanded less coordination after Bladensburg, because one retreat uncovered the road and left major buildings undefended. Baltimore's defenders had watched that sequence closely, and their preparations aimed to prevent any single collapse from opening everything behind it. Major General Samuel Smith, a veteran and militia commander, oversaw defenses developed before the British appeared at the city's approaches. Earthworks east of Baltimore provided a landward barrier, while militia and regulars occupied positions covering likely avenues of advance. Fort McHenry guarded the harbor entrance, supported by additional batteries, obstacles, and vessels arranged to hinder a naval breakthrough. These defenses did not guarantee victory. Many troops were militia, and Britain's veterans had already defeated militia outside Washington. Preparation changed the equation, because defenders no longer had to improvise every position while an enemy column approached through heat. Baltimore also offered something Washington lacked: a dense community whose commercial life and privateering activity depended upon resisting capture. Privateers sailing from the port had preyed upon British commerce, making Baltimore both a strategic target and offensive nuisance. For British planners, destroying that base promised material benefit and another political shock after the spectacle at Washington. Admiral Alexander Cochrane directed the wider campaign, while Cockburn brought local knowledge, and Ross again led troops ashore. Their recent victory encouraged action, but it also carried a misleading comparison from open approaches toward prepared defensive depth. Early September brought the expedition north through the Chesapeake, its ships carrying troops toward the Patapsco River and Baltimore. Defenders could not know exactly where the main landing would come, so observation and communication remained essential across the approaches. Once British troops landed at North Point, their road toward Baltimore narrowed the campaign into a more predictable corridor. The landing placed Ross's veterans roughly 14 miles from the city, with American forces positioned to delay their progress. Delay itself had value. Every hour allowed Baltimore's main defenses to gather strength while British ships confronted the harbor problem. Brigadier General John Stricker led an American force forward from the city, not to decide everything at once. His mission was to contest the approach, measure British strength, and buy time without sacrificing Baltimore's deeper defensive system. The British landing at North Point began a coordinated gamble. Troops would press inland while warships sought passage toward Baltimore's harbor. Ross expected another rapid advance, but woods, narrow roads, and prepared resistance denied the clear route he had found near Washington. Ross was carried from the road mortally wounded, removing the commander whose judgment had guided every recent British land operation. Command passed to Colonel Arthur Brooke, who inherited both the objective and the need to keep advancing despite sudden disruption. Stricker formed his troops across the road near North Point, placing artillery and infantry where terrain compressed the British approach. His position was temporary by design. Baltimore's survival depended less upon holding this field than preserving the defenses behind it. British veterans attacked through resistance that proved firmer than at Bladensburg, although parts of the American line eventually gave way. One militia regiment broke, creating danger along the line, but other units maintained enough order to prevent immediate collapse. Stricker withdrew toward Baltimore after imposing delay and losses, bringing much of his command back into the larger defensive network. North Point was a British tactical success, yet it delivered neither panic nor the open streets that had followed Bladensburg. Brooks' column resumed its advance, now without Ross and with clear evidence that Baltimore's defenders could retreat without disintegrating. Ahead stood the earthworks on Hampstead Hill, backed by thousands of defenders and artillery covering the likely British approach. What looked vulnerable in Washington now appeared layered: an advanced force, a fortified line, reserves, and protected harbor approaches. Brooke examined the defenses and recognized that a direct assault would expose his troops to concentrated fire across prepared ground. Waiting offered no easy solution, because American strength could increase while British supplies and operational freedom diminished steadily ashore. The land force therefore needed the fleet to create an opening, either by passing Fort McHenry or enabling another approach. Without naval movement inside the harbor, Baltimore's defenses could concentrate eastward instead of dividing against a threat from behind. British strategy had reached its decisive constraint. Soldiers could approach the city, but warships had to unlock its defended waterfront. Fort McHenry stood between the fleet and Baltimore, positioned where the harbor narrowed and supported by nearby batteries and obstructions. Major George Armistead commanded its garrison, whose task was endurance rather than defeating the British fleet in open water. Cochrane's heavier ships could not safely force the confined channel while American guns and submerged barriers guarded the route. Bomb vessels and rocket ships could attack from greater distance, trading accuracy for safety beyond the fort's effective response. Before sunrise on September 13th, the bombardment began, sending shells and rockets toward Fort McHenry through worsening weather conditions. Defenders remained largely sheltered until impacts forced movement, repairs, or renewed attention to vulnerable sections of the works around them. British fire continued for hours, but distance and construction limited its ability to silence the fort or compel evacuation. American guns answered when targets approached range, then conserved their crews when British vessels withdrew beyond effective reach again. The exchange produced noise and damage without solving Britain's central problem. Fort McHenry remained occupied and the channel remained closed. A nighttime attempt to move smaller craft westward sought to distract defenders and support troops landing beyond the main fort. Darkness, rain, and confusing sound briefly magnified the threat, but American batteries engaged the boats and disrupted effective coordination. Brooke waited near Baltimore's landward defenses for a naval success that never arrived in the form his assault required. His caution reflected the situation, not timidity. Storming the earthworks without harbor support risked severe losses for uncertain gain. Washington had fallen after its outer defense collapsed. Baltimore still possessed overlapping positions after North Point had been lost. This difference converted time into American strength. Each British delay preserved the fortified line while exposing the expedition's dependence on ships. Through the night, Fort McHenry's garrison endured intermittent bombardment without knowing whether British infantry would appear behind its position. Dawn on September 14th revealed the American flag still flying, confirming that the harbor entrance had not been forced. Francis Scott Key, watching from a vessel under British control, recognized the flag and later shaped the scene into verse. Its later national meaning can obscure the immediate military fact. The fleet had failed to open Baltimore from the water. Lacking that opening, Brooke abandoned the assault, withdrew toward the transports, and left Baltimore's main defensive line untested by attack. The city survived because preparation absorbed a tactical setback, while geography prevented Britain's land and naval forces from combining decisively. Washington's capture now looked less predictive, and events far north would decide whether Britain could regain its lost strategic leverage. Baltimore's survival did not erase Washington's humiliation, but it broke the expected sequence from capital destroyed to resistance collapsing everywhere. Britain's next opportunity lay hundreds of miles north, where an army advanced toward Plattsburgh along the Lake Champlain corridor. This route offered strategic pressure beyond coastal raiding, threatening American territory while strengthening British demands at the peace negotiations. Governor-General George Prevost commanded a force strengthened by veterans released from Europe after Napoleon's first defeat that spring. His column numbered roughly 11,000, though not every man could be safely committed against Plattsburgh's defenses at once. Brigadier General Alexander Macomb held Plattsburgh with a much smaller regular force, reinforced by militia and local volunteers nearby. The British Army moved south along the lake's western side, following roads that tied its progress to supplies from Canada. Lake Champlain was not scenery beside the campaign. It was the transport route protecting movement, provisions, retreat, and reinforcement. Master Commandant Thomas MacDonough organized an American squadron inside Plattsburgh Bay, anchoring where British vessels would have to approach him. Captain George Downey commanded the British squadron assembled to challenge him, including the newly completed frigate Confiance on the lake. Confiance carried formidable firepower, but hurried construction and limited training left parts of her crew without practiced coordination before battle. MacDonough chose his anchorage carefully, placing vessels in line across the bay with shoals restricting British maneuver around him. Extra anchors and lines allowed American ships to pivot, presenting fresh broadsides if their exposed guns became disabled later. That preparation addressed a predictable problem. Anchored ships could not simply sail away when one side absorbed sustained punishment. Instead, rotation could turn an apparently immobilized vessel and bring unused guns against an enemy already damaged by battle. Downey had little freedom to ignore the anchored line because control of the lake required defeating MacDonough's squadron directly. As Prevost approached in early September, Macomb's defenders abandoned exposed positions and concentrated behind the Saranac River within Plattsburgh. Bridges became defensive choke points, while buildings near likely approaches were cleared or prepared to deny British cover nearby. Prevost reached the town and probed American positions, yet a major advance without naval security endangered his entire operation. That restraint was rational. If British troops advanced while losing the lake, their supply route and withdrawal would become vulnerable. A naval victory would protect communications, free boats for transport, and help Prevost outflank defenses centered upon the river. The campaign therefore compressed into one requirement. Downey had to defeat McDonough before Prevost could safely exploit superior numbers. British preparations took time because Confiance needed completion, armament, crew, and integration with smaller vessels on the lake. Every delay helped Macomb strengthen defenses and gather militia, while McDonough refined the anchored formation awaiting Downey's arrival offshore. Prevost could not wait indefinitely. Autumn weather, lengthening supply lines, and negotiations all reduced the value of delay for Britain. On September 11th, the British squadron entered Plattsburgh Bay as Prevost's troops prepared their corresponding movement ashore. Wind initially carried Downey toward the Americans, then weakened inside the bay, complicating his attempt to take the best position. McDonough's anchored line opened fire as British vessels approached, forcing them to fight while completing deployment under pressure. Downey's death early in the engagement deprived Confiance of experienced command, while her crew faced an unfamiliar battle plan. Sustained fire disabled many guns along the engaged sides of both principal ships, apparently exhausting McDonough's options first at anchor. Then, the preparations made before battle became decisive. McDonough hauled upon his anchor lines and rotated Saratoga within the bay. A fresh American broadside now faced Confiance, whose own anchoring arrangements could not produce an equally effective turn under pressure. Confiance eventually struck her colors, and the remaining British vessels could neither escape nor reverse the squadron's defeat alone. The result came from gunnery, but positioning and preparation determined which guns remained usable after the first exchange ended. Ashore, British columns moved against crossings and defenses, but their actions never developed into the fully committed assault Macomb feared. News of the squadron's defeat removed the conditions supporting Prevost's advance, just as his soldiers faced resistance along the Saranac. A numerically superior army now stood south of its secure lake communications, with worsening weather and uncertain supply ahead. Prevost ordered withdrawal toward Canada, converting naval defeat into the abandonment of Britain's most imposing land offensive that year. The retreat surprised officers who believed Macomb could still be overwhelmed, and it later subjected Prevost's judgment to severe criticism. Yet, continuing south without control of Champlain risked trading battlefield superiority for isolation, shortages, and a contested road back north. Britain had lost more than ships at Plattsburgh. It had lost the operational foundation needed to turn invasion into negotiating leverage. Prevost's retreat preserved his army, but it surrendered the territorial pressure Britain needed to support ambitious demands at Ghent. Macomb had not destroyed the invading army. Its withdrawal followed from a naval result that made further advance dangerously unsupported. That chain exposed the campaign's internal logic. British soldiers possessed strength, but British strategy depended upon secure waterborne communications. British commanders could reasonably debate Prevost's caution, yet they could not restore McDonough's captured ships or command of Champlain. Within days, the northern invasion that had appeared most capable of changing borders was moving back toward Canada instead. The contrast with Washington sharpened. At the capital, amphibious access bypassed weak defenses and enabled a short destructive occupation. At Plattsburgh, losing the supporting fleet transformed an army's numerical advantage into a potential liability almost immediately on hostile ground. Baltimore had demonstrated the related lesson from another direction. Naval power could not bypass every fortification or rescue every landward plan. Together, the reversals denied Britain a continuous story of American collapse after the smoke rose above Washington that summer. Instead, British negotiators saw spectacular success balanced by two failed operations whose objectives carried greater strategic value for peace. Negotiations at Ghent had begun during the summer, before news of Washington, Baltimore, or Plattsburgh could arrive promptly there. Atlantic communications imposed delay. Diplomats argued from reports already weeks old, while armies and fleets kept changing their leverage. British representatives initially advanced demands shaped by confidence after Napoleon's defeat and the availability of experienced troops for America. Among the contested issues was a proposed indigenous buffer territory in the Northwest, intended to restrain American expansion there. London also sought arrangements affecting the Great Lakes and boundaries, aiming to convert military pressure into durable security gains. American commissioners rejected terms that would cede territory or compromise sovereignty, even while their government's position appeared fragile at home. Washington's burning seemed to validate British firmness when reports crossed the Atlantic, because capitals usually signaled political vulnerability abroad. No president had been captured, no national army had surrendered, and no American delegation received authority to capitulate there. Madison's administration continued functioning through dispersal and relocation, proving that the physical seat of government was replaceable during war. The fires therefore strengthened Britain's bargaining atmosphere more than its bargaining assets. Occupied ground mattered more than charred walls. Plattsburgh altered that calculation because Prevost's retreat left Britain without the major American territorial acquisition it had anticipated holding. Baltimore's survival compounded the setback. The Chesapeake expedition had failed to destroy the privateering port or seize its harbor. These outcomes did not make America dominant. The blockade still damaged trade, federal finances remained strained, and divisions persisted. British Canada had survived earlier American offensives, while Britain's navy retained overwhelming power along much of the coast offshore. Thus, diplomats on both sides faced an unattractive balance. Continued war promised expense without a reliable path to decision. For Britain, renewed campaigning meant supplying distant operations after decades of warfare against revolutionary and Napoleonic France in Europe. For the United States, endurance meant more blockade, uncertain revenue, exposed communities, and no guarantee of future battlefield success. The rational question was no longer who had suffered the most dramatic humiliation, but what additional fighting could realistically purchase. Britain could demand concessions only if American leaders believed refusal would produce a worse military position than compromise offered. Baltimore and Plattsburgh undermined precisely that belief, showing that preparation could block offensives even after Washington's defenses failed catastrophically. American commissioners learned of improving events gradually, just as British ministers reassessed what their forces could enforce overseas now. Britain's proposed indigenous buffer state gradually receded from the negotiations when military leverage and ministerial priorities shifted against it. The maritime issues that had helped cause the war also lost urgency. After Napoleon's defeat changed Britain's needs at sea. Impressment was not formally resolved by the emerging treaty, but the circumstances driving it had substantially diminished by then. This made restoration more attainable. Each government could accept peace without admitting that its original case had collapsed entirely. Negotiators moved toward restoring pre-war boundaries and returning captured territory rather than rewarding the most visually shocking raid alone. Such terms would not vindicate every American war aim or erase military failures from Detroit through Washington and beyond. Nor would they amount to British defeat. Canada remained secure, and the Royal Navy had demonstrated devastating reach repeatedly. Peace on restored boundaries would establish the central result. Burning Washington had failed to dissolve American sovereignty under military pressure. Before agreement could close the conflict, fighting continued elsewhere, and one battle would later dominate American memory of war. On December 24, 1814, the commissioners at Ghent signed a treaty restoring conquered territory and largely returning pre-war boundaries. Neither side surrendered its independence or secured every original aim. Britain abandoned demands that events had made difficult to enforce. The agreement still had to cross the Atlantic and receive ratification, while armies remained unaware that peace had been signed. Before that news arrived, British forces attacked New Orleans in January, seeking control at the Mississippi's commercially vital mouth. Andrew Jackson's prepared defenses helped inflict a crushing defeat on Major General Edward Pakenham's assault with severe British losses. The battle occurred after Ghent was signed, but before either army knew, proving delayed communication could outlive diplomatic decisions. New Orleans did not produce the treaty or rescue failed negotiations. It transformed how Americans remembered an inconclusive war. Victory replaced images of flight and fire with disciplined earthworks, abandoned British equipment, and a defended gateway to the interior. The United States Senate unanimously approved the treaty in February, and Madison exchanged ratifications soon afterward, formally ending the conflict. Territory generally returned to its pre-war owners, prisoners came home, and the Republic retained the sovereignty Britain had challenged. American success had clear limits. The treaty settled neither impressment nor neutral maritime rights that had driven public arguments for war. Britain retained Canada and maritime supremacy, while American invasions had failed to achieve durable territorial gains north of the border. Indigenous nations paid the gravest strategic price as British support weakened and American expansion faced fewer organized restraints afterward. Families absorbed deaths, displacement, lost commerce, and burned property, while both governments carried financial burdens beyond the treaty's spare language. In Washington, charred masonry remained visible as officials returned and public institutions resumed work amid temporary quarters and repairs. The government survived because its authority, armies, revenue system, territory, and negotiators were dispersed beyond one vulnerable federal city. Britain's raiders could enter, burn, and withdraw, but they lacked the occupation force needed to convert destruction into submission. Defenders at Baltimore denied the next coastal blow, while Macdonough's victory made Prevost's northern advance operationally unsafe without control of Lake Champlain. Those failures deprived the burning of its strategic sequel. Washington became a humiliation Britain could not turn into decisive leverage. The restored capital would eventually rise from blackened walls, while the treaty preserved borders that British fire had not changed. Subscribe for more military history and decide. Was Baltimore's preparation or Plattsburgh's naval victory more important to American survival?